Hi, I'm Isla. My parents banned me from the family reception, and then my dad slapped me right in front of my sister, who laughed and said, "You'll never measure up." They thought they could erase me, steal my inheritance, and rewrite my story, but what they didn't know was that one lawyer's call changed everything. Who really holds the power now? I pulled up to the familiar suburban estate in Virginia just as the early evening light softened the manicured lawns. My heels clicked against the driveway stones, but the sensation of belonging never arrived. The security guard raised an eyebrow as I approached the entrance, scanning his clipboard with a practiced indifference. My name was nowhere to be found on the seating chart, a fact that made my chest tighten with a quiet frustration. I adjusted my dress and forced a smile, hoping it might disguise the sting of being left out once again. Jolene, my stepmother, appeared with her usual cold precision, her lips curved into a polite yet cutting smile. "It's just a family thing, dear. Maybe next time," she said lightly, her eyes glinting with the unspoken judgment. I nodded, swallowed the rising heat in my throat, and looked around. Faces I had known my whole life pretended not to notice me, and my father, across the room, avoided my gaze entirely. That subtle sign of betrayal cut deeper than any insult could. The music in the reception hall blurred into the background as I hesitated at the entrance, weighing my options. An old family friend, spotting my hesitation, gave me a small nod and whispered that I should be there. The gesture was enough. I stepped into the room, feeling the eyes follow me, the murmurs weaving a quiet tension that wrapped around the space like fog. Jolene leaned closer to my father and murmured something. I saw his expression change, awkwardness gave way to fury, and before I could process it, his hand connected with my cheek. The sound was sharp, slicing through the hum of conversation and the delicate notes of the pianist. Glasses clinked nervously, conversations stuttered, and I felt the room pivot around me. I touched my cheek, trembling with the shock, but refused to let tears fall. They wouldn't have that victory. Every gaze felt like a spotlight on my humiliation. Some faces reflected pity, others shock, a few silently judging. Inside, my mind raced, weighing the options: scream, leave, retaliate. None felt satisfying. I remembered my mother's voice, steady and clear from years past: "Never let them see you crumble, Isla." And an old quote I had read resurfaced, echoing in my mind: "Silence is sometimes the loudest scream." I straightened my dress, lifted my chin, and let my eyes meet my father's, not with tears, but with quiet defiance. The room held its breath. Jolene's smirk deepened, she believed she had broken me. I took a deliberate step forward, lowering my voice so only the nearest guests could hear. "If this is what family means to you, I'm proud not to belong." I turned with composure, my purse swinging lightly in my hand as I left. The silence I left behind felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, some tinged with shame, some with curiosity. My father's face registered a flicker of realization. For a brief moment, I could see the thought: he might have just destroyed the person who had always protected his reputation, silently, legally, without ever asking for recognition. As I passed a young server, she handed me a napkin folded into the shape of an olive sprig. Without thinking, I tucked it into my bag, unaware that it would later become my emotional anchor. The drive home was a blur of street lights and quiet highways. I replayed every slight, every calculated move against me: the exclusion from the family firm, the dismissive glances, Jolene's manipulative whispers. My cheek still burned, but my pride bore the deeper sting. A line echoed in my thoughts, steady and unyielding: "You can't shame someone who knows her worth." The words fortified a quiet but determined resolve. They had tried to erase me, but every signature, every document, every piece of family history I had managed legally, remained under my control. I pulled into the driveway, the lights of my home flickering against the dusk, and my eyes found my law degree hanging on the wall. The real meaning of ownership crystallized in that moment: control, strategy, and the truth were still mine. I woke up with a dull throb in my cheek, the faint discoloration a stubborn reminder of last night. Morning light slanted through the blinds of my Richmond apartment, touching the familiar chaos of papers, books, and a half-empty coffee cup. My phone vibrated relentlessly, a chorus of unread messages demanding attention. Most were private apologies, gentle notes of concern from relatives and friends who had witnessed the scene. One message, however, cut deeper than the slap itself, a cousin's text reading, "They said you provoked him." The words landed heavier than my father's hand had. Gossip had already begun circulating in the local Facebook group. Comments ranging from pity to whispered judgment made me feel smaller than I had all night. I switched off the device, letting the silence of my apartment press in. Humiliation traveled faster than truth, and I knew the world would remember only the moment I seemed broken. People don't remember who was right. They remember who looked broken first. I needed a distraction. Pulling out my old legal files, I sifted through familiar folders, hoping to quiet the storm in my mind. That's when I noticed the deed to the family estate. My name, once proudly listed as the secondary co-owner, had vanished. The signature line bore my father's familiar, shaky handwriting, paired with a notarized stamp from the very firm I had once served loyally. Heart pounding, I called a former colleague at the county clerk's office. "It was finalized weeks ago," she said softly, confirming my growing suspicion. The transfer had been done quietly, deliberately, behind my back. I was erased not only emotionally, but legally. They didn't just disinvite me. They disowned me. Grief began to solidify into a focused, methodical anger, one that did not shout but calculated. Memories surfaced with a painful clarity. 6 months ago, Jolene had suggested simplifying family documents to make things less complicated. My father had nodded, the warmth in her hand over his fake, an almost theatrical gesture of trust. Family should trust each other, not question everything, Jolene had said, and I had believed her. My own trust now felt like a misstep, a mistake with consequences far beyond a dinner conversation. My father's voice echoed in my mind, "Don't make everything about business, Isla." Back then, I had nodded, smiling politely. Now, the phrase tasted bitter, revealing the real reason they had drawn me out of the picture. Because law was the only realm where truth could not be rewritten by blood. I paced the small living room, torn between confronting them immediately or crafting a more deliberate approach. I remembered my mentor's advice, "Never react while you're bleeding, you'll stain your own case." That voice grounded me. For now, I would act as if nothing had happened, gathering evidence quietly, methodically. My heart remained bruised, but my mind was precise. I began compiling emails, property records, and witness names. The napkin folded like an olive sprig, which a server had handed me the night before, sat on the counter, a fragile symbol of peace now transformed into a marker for the quiet war I intended to wage. Evening came, and I prepared a cup of tea, sitting at my small kitchen table with the soft hum of the city outside. I wrote a single email to a lawyer I trusted, someone untouched by the treachery of my family. I didn't send it immediately. I wanted precision, confirmation, and control. My father's voice taunted me in my head, "You'll never make it without this family," I whispered back to the empty room, steady and unwavering, "Watch me." The resolve in that whisper hardened into certainty. The humiliation, the anger, the quiet sting of betrayal, all had been reframed into purpose. This was no longer about last night, about the slap, or even Jolene's smirk. This was about reclaiming identity, asserting rights, and exposing truth that could not be silenced. I pressed send, and as the message disappeared into the digital ether, I felt the first genuine spark of agency in days, a calm anticipation of the storm to come. The email notification pinged softly on my laptop, drawing me away from the quiet hum of my Richmond apartment. I opened the attachment and froze. It was from my lawyer, a scanned packet of legal documents I had never seen before. The final revision of my father's will glared back at me with its cold, impersonal language. Every page felt like a calculated knife, slicing through the fragile trust I had built over years. The redistribution of the estate wasn't subtle. Jolene and my half-sister Carly had been given tangible heirlooms, properties, and family artifacts once belonging to my late mother. My mother's quilt, the one she held in countless photographs, now appeared on a list of items reclaimed for others. Jewelry, vintage china, even small keepsakes, all accounted for, all reallocated. It wasn't simply about money, it was about erasing me from her story, scrubbing my presence from the family legacy. I moved toward a framed photograph of my mother, holding that quilt, and felt the weight of their calculated removal press down like a leaden hand. I was transported back to the first week Jolene moved in, my memory sharp despite the years. I was 15, and she began tidying, labeling boxes, her smiles far too polite to be genuine. My father, distant as ever since the funeral, said, "It's time we all moved on." I remember discovering Jolene trying on my mother's ring that morning. When I confronted her, she replied casually, almost amused, "Just checking the fit. Don't be dramatic." Back then, these actions had felt benign, even forgettable. Now, they screamed as early markers of erasure, small invasions that set the stage for a larger betrayal. My past wasn't lost, it had been quietly repackaged, reassigned, and now, coldly, reclassified as property. The next hour was spent at the storage unit I had shared with the family years ago, a place I thought safe, untouched. But the box labeled Mom's keepsakes was gone. The empty space was filled with discarded Christmas decor, a cruel replacement for memory. I called the storage company under the guise of confirming an inventory list. The representative's casual confirmation that my father had accessed the unit 2 months prior hammered the truth home: this was intentional. The theft was not only of items but of meaning, of connection, of a bridge between past and future. "They stole what I would have handed to my daughter one day," I murmured aloud, the sound of my own voice punctuating the weight of their erasure. Pain turned inward, manifesting as guilt and doubt. Had I waited too long to confront them? Was I too trusting, too silent, too willing to keep the peace when it was being taken advantage of? Internal monologues spiraled. Silence had been permission. To fight without evidence would have seemed petty, but to ignore their manipulation had allowed them free rein. I opened a notebook, intending to document every memory, every item, every conversation I could recall. Not for the world, not yet. This was for me, a reclamation of spirit, a record that said, she existed. I existed. And they cannot erase that. Late afternoon faded into evening, and I found myself walking the familiar path to my mother's grave, journal in hand. The grave was meticulously maintained, yet beside it was a newer stone. Jolene's father had been buried there. I stood in front of my mother's resting place, whispering the words that had taken root in my chest: "They took your resting place too." Trembling, my resolve hardened. This was the moment where grief became action, where sorrow became strategy. I left the cemetery with one thought clear and burning: if they erased my story, I would make them remember it, legally, publicly, permanently. And with that promise, the quiet storm inside me began to coalesce into an unwavering plan. The morning light spilled softly across my Richmond apartment, illuminating stacks of boxes I had barely touched since moving in. I knelt beside one of them, brushing off a thin layer of dust, and discovered a sealed envelope tucked into the corner. My heart skipped as I read the familiar handwriting, my mother's. The letter was dated just weeks before her passing, a message meant solely for me. Her words were tender, yet carried a sharp edge of caution. She spoke of trust, of vigilance, of the value she saw in me even when others dismissed it. Between the lines, hints of hidden inheritance surfaced, clues about keepsakes and documents she feared would be misappropriated. I read it over and over, a mix of tears and resolve swelling inside me. Each word seemed to whisper, "Remember who you are. Protect what is yours." The quiet in the apartment deepened, but my focus sharpened. This was no longer just grief, it was a mission seeded long before my father's betrayal became visible. Turning through old family documents that had been stored alongside the letter, I noticed subtle, yet alarming changes. Account signatures shifted, minor properties were reassigned, family trust documents altered, all without my knowledge. My father's and Jolene's fingerprints were on decisions that had seemed harmless at the time, but now formed a deliberate timeline of marginalization. I remembered a family brunch months ago when I had asked about inheritance plans. My father had laughed, dismissing my questions with a phrase that had seemed trivial then, but now echoed as a warning. Each piece of evidence aligned into a disturbing pattern. Manipulation had been methodical, not accidental. The betrayal stung sharply, yet it also brought clarity. I whispered to myself, I was supposed to stay quiet, to never ask, to never remember, but I do. I organized the letters, receipts, and legal files into a dedicated folder, taking care to separate each document by date and significance. A list of questions formed in my mind: which items had been removed, who had witnessed transfers, which documents were missing. Consulting a lawyer specializing in family estates became a priority, a way to approach the situation with strategic patience rather than reactive anger. I instructed friends to limit discussions with me, wary of emotional leaks that might reach the wrong ears. Amid the papers, a small paper clip folded into the shape of a leaf caught my attention: my mother's stationery, serving as a silent reminder of the mission she had left in my hands. Calm vigilance settled over me, a quiet fire replacing the raw shock I had felt the day before. Mapping the movements of my father and Jolene, I drew lines connecting actions to outcomes, seeing for the first time the chessboard they had played so meticulously. Every favor granted, every small concession, every sly smile was part of a larger design to control not only the estate but the narrative of my life. The gaps in their strategy became apparent, their grasp was firm, but not unbreakable. I recognized my own silence as a tool that had allowed them to act unchecked, but now it was reframed as preparation, years of observing, waiting, learning. Acceptance of past mistakes mingled with empowerment. I whispered aloud, almost with reverence, "They played chess. I'm finally ready to see the board clearly." By late afternoon, I had reviewed the letters once more, tracing the references to documents and keepsakes, feeling the weight of nostalgia and sorrow, but also the crisp edge of determination. Among the lines of my mother's handwriting, I noticed a coded reference to a safety deposit box, off-site, where hidden documents might reside. My pulse quickened with a mix of fear and anticipation. This box could contain the proof, the leverage, the missing pieces that would expose the years of deceit and manipulation. The apartment felt charged, electric with suspense. I set down the letter, taking a steadying breath, and whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, I see what they thought I would never find." Afternoon sunlight spilled through the blinds, casting long, narrow stripes across the stacks of papers and folders I had assembled over the past days. Each document, letters, bank records, property transfers, was a breadcrumb trail leading to the truth my father and Jolene had tried so hard to bury. I took a deep breath, feeling the simmering frustration rise, but carefully pushed it down. Today wasn't about anger, it was about preparation. I highlighted critical evidence with colored tabs, creating a visual map of their deceptions, and rehearsed responses to every likely excuse, every half-truth they might throw back at me. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind stayed sharp, the clarity of purpose anchoring me. Questions lined up neatly in my notebook, ready to guide the conversation when I met my lawyer. It was time to turn suspicion into actionable knowledge. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old leather and polished wood, the kind of space that invited careful conversation. Sitting across from me, my trusted attorney leafed through my organized packet, eyes narrowing as the patterns became apparent. "Isla," he said quietly, "these account reallocations and property transfers were executed without your consent. Some of them are legally contestable, even though they've tried to make them look routine." Shock washed over me, but it mingled quickly with cautious hope. For the first time since the reception, I felt tangible power, evidence that could be leveraged, strategies that could be employed. We talked through each document, each witness note, each obscure legal clause, mapping a path forward. My pulse quickened, but the anger simmered beneath control, tempered by the lawyer's steady guidance. This was no longer abstract betrayal, it was a puzzle I could solve. Back at the apartment, I spread all the documents across the dining table, drafting an outline to confront my father and Jolene. Each line of correspondence, each shifted signature, each late-night notarization formed a damning tapestry of deceit. As I reviewed past events, flashes of memory, dismissed questions, cold smiles, offhand remarks, suddenly revealed their true weight. Every small slight was part of a calculated strategy to marginalize me, to rewrite the narrative of my family's wealth and legacy. My anger grew, but it was measured, sharp yet strategic. I debated internally whether to confront them publicly, to expose the manipulation at a gathering, or privately, to test their responses. Each choice carried risk, each held the potential for revelation. I reached for my phone and dialed a close friend, someone who knew the tangled dynamics of my family and my history. As I spoke, sharing pieces of evidence, I gauged reactions, testing perspectives. Her voice reassured me, offering validation I had not sought in years but desperately needed. I practiced my responses aloud, anticipating gaslighting, disbelief, and excuses. The mother's letter stayed beside me, a quiet moral anchor. It reminded me who I was, why I was standing here at all, and how the truth could not be denied forever. Confidence began to replace the lingering doubt, the simmering fear melting into clarity and focus. As evening approached, I made the decision. Tomorrow, I would confront them during a family gathering, choosing a moment when my presence and words could not be ignored. My chest tightened with anticipation and anxiety, but determination overrode hesitation. Every line rehearsed, every document marked, every memory revisited, the preparation was complete. I allowed myself one final glance at the letters and records, my eyes lingering on the paperclip shaped like a leaf from my mother's stationery. It symbolized continuity, morality, and the endurance of truth. I whispered softly to myself, tomorrow, I step into the room knowing they cannot silence me anymore. A quiet resolve settled over me, unshakable, ready to confront the lies that had haunted my life for far too long. I parked my car just beyond the main gates of the estate, taking a moment to steady my breath. The late afternoon sunlight painted the sprawling lawns in gold and shadow, but I barely noticed the beauty. My mind was focused on the folders tucked under my arm, the culmination of weeks of digging through deceit, manipulation, and carefully hidden truths. As I walked up the familiar drive, I scanned the faces greeting guests, noting the subtle glances and stiff postures, the way my stepmother's eyes narrowed slightly when she saw me, or how my father's jaw tightened as if bracing for a storm. My pulse quickened, a mix of anticipation and controlled anger, but I forced my posture to remain calm. Mental boundaries formed instantly: observe, assess, respond, and never react too early. Stepping into the reception hall, I approached my father politely yet deliberately, keeping my tone neutral, my words measured. "I've noticed some recent changes in the family accounts," I said, sliding a folder just enough for him to glance at it. "These transactions seem inconsistent with prior agreements." Shock flashed across his face, his practiced composure momentarily cracking. Jolene leaned closer, attempting a whisper, an unseen nudge of manipulation, but I ignored it, eyes fixed on my father. The air thickened with tension as relatives nearby sensed the confrontation, whispers trailing behind us. My pulse remained steady, my mind calculating every possibility, every rebuttal they might conjure. I refused to let my emotions betray the truth I carried in my hands. As the discussion intensified, the family's tactics became overt. Subtle jabs turned to pointed comments in front of others, attempts to belittle me under the guise of casual observation. "You're overthinking, Isla," my father said, a tight smile masking his anxiety. "Some things are just family business." Each phrase was a trap, an effort to confuse and discredit me publicly. I remained composed, redirecting every comment toward facts, legal implications, and documented evidence. The documents themselves became my silent allies, references slipped seamlessly into conversation, keeping them off balance. I felt a strange, almost intoxicating surge of control, my anger quiet but potent, harnessed strategically, each retort reinforcing my moral and intellectual upper hand. I scanned the room discreetly, confirming supportive relatives and friends who could silently witness the integrity of my position. Subtle nods, brief eye contact, a raised eyebrow, they were my silent witnesses, validating my points without alerting the opposition. Confidence surged through me, a tangible boost that steadied my resolve. I had allies in plain sight, and their presence reminded me I was not alone, that the manipulation would be exposed with credibility. My mother's letter remained tucked in my folder, a moral compass and reminder that the fight was as much for truth as it was for justice. The room's energy shifted slightly, tension ebbing and flowing with each measured statement. Just when I thought the upper hand was mine, my father produced a new document, waving it with a triumphant smile. "Perhaps you missed this," he said, the tone calculated to provoke doubt. My heart skipped, anxiety spiking, but I refused to falter. Jolene's eyes glinted with mischief, a silent signal that more surprises were planned. Every scenario I had rehearsed met an unforeseen twist, forcing me to pivot instantly. I absorbed the shock, adjusted my strategy, and maintained a composed exterior while the internal gears spun rapidly, calculating the next moves. In that charged silence, I realized the battle was far from over, but my resolve hardened. Every deception they attempted to weave was now part of a game I fully understood. Tomorrow, the confrontation would evolve, and I would be ready for whatever they thought I would never see coming. The estate felt different that evening, quieter yet charged, like the air before a storm. I lingered in the shadows of the drawing room, observing the interactions, noting subtle exchanges that previously went unnoticed. My father's smiles were tighter, Jolene's laughter a little too forced, and the way Carly darted her eyes to my corner of the room suggested unease. Slowly, I started mapping alliances, identifying those who might quietly support me or at least remain neutral. The anticipation coiled within me, a mixture of caution and rising confidence, sharpening my mental focus. Every detail mattered, the way a hand lingered over a wine glass, the angle of a glance, a hesitant nod. Tonight, I would use every observation to inform my next moves, carefully structuring a plan that relied as much on patience as it did on strategy. Reviewing financial documents and contracts, I noticed inconsistencies I had previously missed, subtle alterations that contradicted verbal assurances and past agreements. I cross-referenced statements with supportive witnesses who had observed these exchanges over the years. Piece by piece, the discrepancies formed a pattern that revealed the true nature of their manipulations. Cautious satisfaction replaced the earlier tension, control returned gradually as I realized that their carefully constructed image of dominance had vulnerabilities I could exploit. My pulse steadied, my mind aligning with purpose, and I felt the first stirrings of empowerment that came not from anger alone but from clarity and foresight. I chose my moment to escalate the confrontation. Addressing my father and stepmother directly, I spoke with precision, presenting evidence while keeping my tone measured. Each word cornered them without aggression, revealing misrepresented facts and inconsistencies that could no longer be brushed aside. Their attempts to push back were minor, almost automatic, revealing an underestimation of my preparation. Anxiety flickered, tempered by strategy, as I guided the conversation, controlling the narrative without letting emotion dictate the pace. Their discomfort was palpable, but I stayed composed, letting the evidence speak louder than any raised voice could. Every measured exchange heightened my sense of control, transforming past frustration into calculated assertiveness. Strategic positioning became paramount. I subtly reinforced alliances among supportive relatives and neutral parties, drawing their attention to key points without openly revealing my intentions. My knowledge of prior manipulations, woven into the discussion, served to underscore credibility and subtly highlight their vulnerabilities. Each nod, glance, and quiet observation of allies validated the narrative I was establishing, bolstering my confidence. I felt a renewed sense of agency, the room shifted under the weight of truth and careful planning, and I knew that the tides were turning, that my intelligence and preparation had restored equilibrium in a space that once seemed dominated by deceit. Then, the curveball arrived. An unexpected witness, previously unseen, approached with documents contradicting my assumptions, a fabricated claim presented as fact. My heart raced for a moment, a flash of alertness, but I steadied myself instantly, absorbing the shock, recalibrating strategy on the spot. Every scenario I had anticipated collided with this sudden twist, but my preparation allowed me to pivot gracefully. I acknowledged the development without showing weakness, integrating it into my plan, and mentally outlining the decisive moves I would execute. Just when I thought I had predicted every move, they threw a curveball that changed everything, forcing me to act with both immediacy and precision. The night was far from over, but I was ready to turn this unexpected move into an advantage, poised for the confrontation that would define the course of what remained to be won. The night air inside the estate seemed heavier than usual, every chandelier casting long shadows over faces I had once trusted. I reviewed my notes one last time, the evidence neatly organized in my hands, each document a testament to years of careful observation, quiet collection, and methodical preparation. Mentally, I rehearsed every line I would speak, every angle I would expose, knowing that timing and delivery would make the difference between mere accusations and undeniable proof. My heart pulsed steadily, a controlled rhythm underlined by subtle excitement, as I positioned allies strategically within the room to witness each step of the unfolding confrontation. Nothing would be left to chance tonight, every move was calculated, deliberate, and purposeful. The weight of anticipation pressed against my chest, yet it was steady and focused, not fear. This was my moment. I stepped forward, facing my father and Jolene with calm precision, presenting the first piece of evidence. My voice was firm but measured, articulating inconsistencies in past statements, financial transfers, and trust adjustments without a hint of emotional breakdown. The air thickened with tension as I highlighted the manipulation they had orchestrated over years, exposing not just the facts but the deliberate erasure of my rights and memories. My father's eyes flickered with surprise, Jolene's smirk faltering, and I felt a quiet satisfaction as the truth carved its way through their defenses. Each back and forth exchange intensified, their attempts at deflection and subtle gaslighting met with pre-planned responses, each piece of evidence reinforcing my credibility and dismantling their narrative. Then the family escalated, introducing sudden objections and false claims, attempting to regain the narrative they had so carefully controlled. I adapted instantly, producing supporting documents and corroborating witness accounts I had strategically arranged. Their strategy crumbled under the weight of meticulously gathered facts, and for the first time in years, I felt the empowerment of absolute moral and factual vindication. Allies nearby gave subtle nods of acknowledgement, reinforcing my position without overt interference, a quiet army of support validating my efforts. The balance of power shifted with each revelation, and I could sense the fear creeping into previously confident faces. My measured fury had transformed into controlled dominance. The pivotal moment arrived with a single, decisive piece of evidence, an authenticated letter from my mother detailing her wishes and expressing concern about the ongoing manipulations. Presenting it publicly validated every claim I had made and discredited any lingering attempts at denial. The room went silent, the only sound the rustle of papers and a few hesitant murmurs. Relief surged through me, tempered by the gravity of confrontation. Triumph was mine, but it was measured, not celebratory. Every detail had been accounted for, every move anticipated, and for once, the truth stood unchallenged at the center of the family hall. My focus, my patience, my intelligence had all converged into this singular moment of vindication. Just as I thought the confrontation had reached its conclusion, a final, unexpected development arose, a minor but potentially destabilizing claim introduced quietly by an unanticipated witness. I paused, absorbing the information, recalculating the angles, and preparing for immediate response. Even in triumph, the lesson remained clear: family dynamics never adhered to simple rules, and vigilance must persist. The room, now tense yet subdued, held a collective awareness that the game had changed irrevocably. I had seized control, but the undercurrents reminded me that power was not static, and the final outcome would depend on continued clarity and strategic foresight. The morning sun filtered softly through the windows of the family estate, illuminating the quiet aftermath of the previous night's confrontation. I watched the faces around me, each processing what had transpired. My father's composure was strained, Jolene's usual smugness replaced by a thin veneer of caution. The room, once charged with tension, now held a different energy, an uneasy acknowledgement that the facts could no longer be denied. I verified, in subtle glances and careful listening, that every piece of evidence had been recognized, leaving no room for easy counter-arguments. Relief settled over me, but it was tempered with alertness. One last minor resistance from a cousin hinted that the emotional currents of the family could still ripple unexpectedly. I breathed deeply, aware that the confrontation had shifted the balance, yet the full resolution required careful navigation. Later that day, I met with my lawyer in the quiet office downtown, papers spread meticulously across the table. Every transfer, every disputed account, and every property title was revisited, confirmed, and formalized. My lawyer outlined the final steps, ensuring no loopholes remained that could undo months of careful planning and observation. My pulse slowed as empowerment replaced anxiety, a tangible relief that the legal affirmation now matched the moral one. Then, a single document appeared, a small, overlooked certificate verifying ownership of a parcel of land my father had quietly tried to reassign. It was the final piece, subtle but critical, cementing my position fully. I felt the weight of years of vigilance and patience crystallize into a definitive victory, a testament to persistence and strategic foresight. Returning to the estate, I observed my family's reactions unfold naturally. Some, like my younger cousins, seemed genuinely remorseful, their eyes reflecting understanding and surprise at the layers of deception they had witnessed. Others remained defensive, their postures tight, words clipped, still seeking ways to minimize accountability. I reflected quietly, aware that self-respect and personal boundaries mattered more than universal approval. Their behavior would no longer dictate my sense of worth. I could interact cautiously, maintaining clarity and dignity without succumbing to past patterns of guilt or deference. The room felt lighter, not unburdened, but balanced, emotional dynamics recalibrated and observed from a secure vantage. As evening approached, I found a moment alone, seated with my mother's letters and a few symbolic keepsakes I had reclaimed. The journey from humiliation and betrayal to control and validation had been long, but each step had strengthened my understanding of resilience. I remembered the lessons embedded in those letters: trust carefully, observe keenly, and assert value without hesitation. The realization settled deeply: courage was not a single act but a series of deliberate choices, made consistently under pressure. My reflection extended beyond strategy, it touched identity and the conscious reclaiming of self, now entwined with the tangible results of my actions. The letters, the napkin folded like an olive sprig, even the smallest tokens of memory, resonated with closure and continuity. In the quiet of the estate, I allowed a final inward glance at the family I had navigated with intelligence, patience, and resilience. The battles won were significant, yet the journey toward understanding and cautious reconciliation would continue. I acknowledged the lingering tensions, accepting that full emotional settlement could not be immediate. My voice, steady and deliberate, echoed inwardly: I had won the battle, but the journey of understanding and forgiveness was just beginning. There was fulfillment, a sense of narrative completion, and a measured optimism that the future could be approached with clarity, wisdom, and the knowledge that my ground had been firmly and strategically claimed.